welcome to everybody on the panel. I must admit to some feeling of trepidation about this particular job on three counts. One, the star power that I'm actually having to deal with. Two, the fact that I'm usually used to being on the receiving end of this, not on the managing end of it. And three, most of all, if you're talking about money, then you certainly don't want a civil servant trying to tell you about how to make any. But we do what we're asked to do, and anybody who's had to deal with the organizers of the JLF get to know very quickly, when you're asked to jump, your only answer is how high. So, without much ado, let me start with this magnificent panel. And what I thought we would do to make this as interactive as possible is to throw out a few ideas and have our panelists speak. And in between, we can try and steer the conversation around rather than have longish set pieces. And of course, I'll open the floor out to the audience to come in on this. The topic, of course, is timely. And it is, I believe, of value and interest to all of us, particularly those of you who have decided not to listen to a conversation on Stephen Hawking and have actually come here, which actually doesn't tell you very much about your own good sense, but anyway. Capitalism today is, if it is believed, it is in crisis. We read in every serious conversation about the challenge of governments dealing with the markets and the risk that government interventions are making things worse for the idea that markets are supposed to perform in an unfettered way and create the most fair and objective grounds for being able to generate value. We also learn or apprehend that a purely econometric way of doing things may or may not be the best way of saving the planet. For we are, for all intents and purpose, in an existential crisis when it comes to our environment. In this case, let me begin by asking Vindi Banga if it is fair to say that today we are at a tension point between policymakers and the market on one hand, and the idea of doing something about the environment and market on the other hand.
Look, I think that there is no perfect system. And I think we should start with that idea, because otherwise we are looking for a holy grail. Uplifting the world, uplifting the quality of life of billions of people, solving these challenges is a complex task. This being said, I think if you think about the progress the world has made in the last 20 or 30 years, it's really positive. Of course there are challenges, but just think about the way in which globalization, now people are already saying it's the end of globalization. I don't think it is at all. I think globalization has played a very major role in uplifting the quality of life of people in the southern hemisphere. 1 billion people have come out of poverty. That's not a small number or a small achievement. There's been much greater cooperation and trade across the whole world. And that has happened because of the activity of globalized companies, multinationals, and so on. If you think about multinational corporations, they are a source of great value addition in the main. There are always good actors and bad actors, but that is true for everyone in society. There are good citizens and bad citizens. So I think we must be careful not to actually paint everything on the negative. Multinationals have created huge value around the world, and I mean societal value, not shareholder value. The best of those companies, if you're interested, we can go into this in detail. The best companies actually survive generationally for 100 years because they create societal value, and by doing that, create shareholder value, not the other way around.
Dr. Currivan, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I mean, I certainly think let's make perfect the enemy of good. And I agree with Vindi, I think we've come some way. But I would also suggest that we do now recognize that we are in an existential tipping point. And often it's described as a meta-crisis, and we can see it in those terms. But I'd like to perhaps begin to reframe that as a metamorphosis, because the way that we've come to this meta-crisis, it seems to me, is that we've had worldview and consequential behaviours that have essentially been based on a mechanistic perspective that goes back 150 years at the time that the Industrial Revolution was coming forward, and therefore our economics are essentially a framing of that worldview and to help drive that Industrial Revolution. But we're 150 years further on, and the science of today is actually showing us, with the latest evidence, a very different perspective. And instead of a universe of separation, which therefore, almost encourages behaviours that reflect that, whether it's conflict or exploitation, whatever it may be, we're now coming to a perspective of what I refer to as a unitive worldview, which is actually converging with universal wisdom teachings and indigenous teachings. And, with a wonderful community here of the Indian heritage, the Vedic traditions of ancient India. So we're actually at a point now, it seems to me, where we are in a meta-crisis that could become an evolutionary metamorphosis if we can wake up, literally, to remember that we're not separate, that we and the whole world are inseparable. We are unique, we are diverse, and therefore I would echo Vindi. I think one of the greatnesses we've come to have is the diversity of our humanness, and the gifts that we can actually bring forward if we come together and link up and lift up together in that regard. But I do feel that the economics is an outdated hangover from the last century and a half. And so I'm working with people like John Fullerton and others who are looking to move from these type of economics to reform and reset and transition and transform piece by piece, because the way we act in the world, the way we behave in the world reflects our worldview, and vice versa. So I think this is a journey forward, if we choose to take it, that can be the most incredible progress, literally on inner and outer levels, that as a human species we've ever seen.
Dinesh, you're doing a lot particularly on the green economy and green transitions.
Well, I'll give you both sides. I totally agree with Vindi and you, Jude, but Vindi on abundance. We have lived, our standard of living is the best it's ever been in history. And I'm talking about it as people, not as a country. But Lord Rees, who's speaking in another room, has 4 problems that we need to tackle: environmental degradation, population, pandemics, and massive cyber attacks. But if you look at population, the United States, per capita, income is $70,000. India, per capita income is $3,000, approximately, which means that India has to go up 22 times, and we're talking about, because energy and GDP are totally correlated, and we're talking about 22x to just reach the United States here at this point. Now, I can look at short-term versus long-term. I'm in the solar business. The best inverters and the best panels are made in China. 9 of the 10 largest companies are in China. Their research and development is second to none. We have to buy from China. We can't just turn around and say, sorry, you're being acquisitive from a land point of view or a political point of view, we're not going to buy. So I looked up some statistics today, and in 2023, China and India were the largest trading partner. China was the largest trading partner with India, 120 billion. And it's not just India. United States, the Chinese supply 500 billion to the United States every year. So whatever Trump says and whatever President Biden says, we can't buy in America first and all that, the money flows where the best products and value are. I can carry on, but I will let you go again, Vikram.
Well, on this specific point, actually, it does beg the question. It isn't, after all, just governments intervening in favor of a particular set of people within their own country or a particular set of industries. It is increasingly in an era of geopolitical contestation and geoeconomic contestation. There is a sense that we do need to have reshoring or friendshoring of value chains of production. You do need to have an investment in national champions. The IRA, and I hasten to say here, I mean the Inflation Reduction Act, at least here I should say it. It seems important to be able to emphasize the fact that there is clearly then a sense that politics, geopolitics, is driving a wedge where you would say pure classical economic theory would militate against. In other words, as you're saying, Dinesh, there is clearly a business case to say we should be buying from wherever it is cheapest. But increasingly, policymakers are not taking that option. Would you chip in on that?
Look, I think you're right. And I think there has been a backlash, Vikram, which you're referring to this extreme, let's say, 3 decades of globalization. And the reason for that, let's just analyze the reason. The reason is fundamentally this, that the jobs that have been created have been largely created in the southern hemisphere. And therefore, the pressure is on this part of the world to be innovative and to actually solve some of the challenges that are emerging in these societies, whether it's the US or the UK or Europe, etc. And that's why there's so much pressure on immigration and so on and so forth. But if you just stand back and think about what Dinesh was saying, I've just come back from China. I was there for a week. And there's been an auto expo there the week before that. And do you know what the price is of a really good quality basic electric car in China? It's 9,000 euros. Now, the reason why it's 9,000 euros is everyone in the West would say, oh, it's because there's some artificial subsidization and so on. Well, maybe there's some of that, but maybe it's also because they have a really large market. 40% of the cars in Shanghai have green number plates. They're electric vehicles. We haven't got there yet. So I think that some of this backlash is because the West is facing those economic concepts. West has got richer, the companies have got richer, but actually they have not been able to solve the problem of jobs and so on in this part of the world. And I think that's the tension. The second tension point is, of course, around the environment, which I totally agree with. I think you said there's a degradation of the environment. Yes. I think the West has and continues to, not just has, it has and continues to live at a very high impact on the carbon sink.
Sure.
That's why we all enjoy these lifestyles. Look at our homes. Look at the temperature at which they're heated and cooled in summer. So that is the West. That's the $70,000 plane. The developing markets, the southern hemisphere, has a double challenge. The first challenge is they've got to grow their per capita incomes. You heard the numbers from Dinesh. And they've got to grow that without the benefit of cheap oil. So that's one challenge. And second challenge, they are facing a greater challenge on climate. So I think the onus is on the richer countries, Western societies, to actually help the world solve this problem. And it has to be done through international cooperation. So actually, it's the opposite of what people are trying to do. Instead of drawing the barriers, they need to figure out a way to solve some of these issues.
Just to, sorry, I should push the ball around, but just to take that thought a little bit further. In an ideal world, of course, we should be looking at a means by which we have greater capacity to cooperate and make available alternate sources of technology, including in particular in the green energy transition. But the reality is, if you see the numbers, the per capita consumption of carbon equivalent in India is a fraction of what it is in the West.
Sure.
It's a fraction of what it is in the UK, which is, for instance, a country 20 plus times smaller in terms of population.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there is an obvious tension in this. How do you actually get this to work when technology is currently the one thing that the West does have, which it can extract a value price for, and not unfairly, I'm not criticizing anybody for doing that, compared to what, say, East Asian manufacturers can leverage in terms of scale of production. So in an ideal economic sense, if you are to look at your comparative advantage, you are essentially now arguing that you sacrifice your competitive advantage in terms of technology to further empower developing markets like India or China to make available technology for them to then be even stronger competitors. I mean, I would love it, of course, speaking as an Indian diplomat for a moment, but is this credible then in the space that we live in?
Well, I'd like to take a step back, really, because you use the word competitive. And it seems to me that all of this is being approached from a worldview of separation. And we cannot go on like this. And the young people know we cannot go on like this. If we see everything as, a competitor and a conflictual opponent, everything is the same nail to hammer on. We can go on like this, but it seems to me that the sort of lessons of history, and we don't have her story, maybe we should, but the lessons of history are suggesting that, a time's come now where we cannot go on as we have been. And that's certainly been recognised at the United Nations, whatever the pluses and negatives of that community are. But the Secretary-General realises that without deep and rapid transformation, we cannot get through this time. We cannot keep seeing each other as just competitive. We need, when I wrote a book called The Story of Gaia, I looked at the whole story of our planetary home. And the whole story of the last 4 billion years up to here is one of collaboration. Ecosystems, healthy ecosystems collaborate. There is healthy competition, but to go to the next level of complexity is always cooperative. Whether it's from single cells to multi-cells to plants to ecosystems to us. If we are not able to find ways of overcoming this innate perception of separation, which science is now showing us is illusory, and Martin and I have the same mentor as Stephen Hawking did, who is Dinesh Dhamija. And Dinesh Dhamija had this wonderful guide. He said, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence is showing us that we can no longer consider ourselves to be in that fragmentation, separation, because it of itself is illusory. And it's not just theoretical. It's how we make our choices every day. Do we make them from relationship and reciprocity? Or do we make them out of fear or scarcity or competition? Because the economics of today is based on the latter. And the economics, hopefully, that we can move to, and the ethics we can move to, is the former.
So I guess you're basically suggesting behavioral change in some form.
Yes.
So how would you, Dinesh, how would you create the capacity to push behavioral change?
I'm not going to answer that question. But I will make 2 or 3 points that were made earlier. We should look at people rather than countries.
Yes.
So 1.45 billion people in India, 1.45 billion, let's say, in China. And how much do they use, is the point you made, Vikram, on carbon, generating carbon, et cetera, needs to be put through, rather than India is the largest or China is the largest. Now, this is a Western theory, which I think that needs to be pushed by the East. The second point is, as you know, newspapers cannot be believed all the time. We've seen that in the exit polls in India. We've seen that here. The Conservatives, for example, and Labour control all the newspapers and the channels, and so they'll only spout their point of view. What really matters is what people do. And it's very difficult to put your finger on what they're doing all the time, of course. The third thing that I want to talk about is jobs. I don't know why we're not doing more trade deals, and I'm not talking about the India-UK trade deal, but I was head of the European Parliament on trade with India, and I found out that for every 60,000 euros they exported to India, they'd create one new job in Europe, which relates to around 53, let's say 50,000 pounds in the UK. And I've been saying that, and by the way, when you do a trade deal, tariffs come down. And when they come down, trade doubles within 3 years. That's the case in every trade deal that I have looked at that the Europeans did around the world. So we from the UK export 15 billion to India. This will go to 30 billion. The extra 15 billion divided by 50,000 is 300,000 new jobs. What's wrong with that? On the Indian side, they export 23 billion to the UK. That doubles. They get 1 million jobs extra. Now, with all the young people coming into the workforce in India, 1 million jobs over 3 years is not a bad deal. And these trade deals need to be done fast. So that's and jobs are the most important thing for everyone's sanity, you know, for the country's taxation, you know, getting money, getting the roads done, the police, etc. The last point I'd like to make is solar. Where does the sun shine the most? Between the Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer. These countries are the poorest in the world. If we can harness solar energy, and by the way, a day of solar energy is enough for the whole world. If we can harness the solar energy in this circle around the globe, these countries become really rich. And because they'll become rich, they'll have better education, less war. The other countries that come in and say, why don't you do this, and meddle with their affairs, will wane away. And that's why solar is absolutely vital to get everyone on some sort of an even keel.
Could I just pick up what's been said in your question about giving up your competitive advantage by helping, let's say, developing countries evolve? Well, I think, first of all, you have to think long-term, not short-term. And I think by drawing up the bridges and trying to build a wall around your country, that just shows that, in a way, I think that is being bereft of ideas. And that doesn't, in my book, doesn't actually argue for the strong competitive advantage these countries have. They should have the self-confidence and responsibility to actually do the opposite. It is in our self-interest sitting here. Let's talk about immigration. You can't solve the immigration problem by drawing up barriers necessarily. You might solve it for a few weeks or a few months. But actually, if the challenges we're talking about, if the impact of climate change or indeed the relative poverty continues, or the disparity in incomes, this will become a flood of refugees moving for better prospects from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. So in other words, we have to think proactively about how we're going to improve the economies and what can we do. And we can do this as a government, we can do it as a business. I mean, again, if you think about a business, if there's a defense company here and India needs defense equipment, well, it's an obvious partnership between the technology that exists here and the marketplace there. If part of that means that manufacturing must be done in India and actually jobs should be created there, that should be part of the deal. It should be part of the bargain because it's a win-win on all sides.
Absolutely.
So I think that is the way to think about it. I mean, the company, I went to China with Helion. We're a healthcare business. And we are in partnership there, working in partnership with the Chinese government on preventive healthcare. That's great for Helion's business, of course, but it's great for China. And if it's great for China, it will eventually benefit many, many companies. So I think that, it is a little short-sighted to say, let's draw up the bridges and actually prevent things from going out. Maybe one last thought, which is that even from a security point of view, a global security point of view, the potential withdrawal of the US, which has been, for better or for worse, and I'm not arguing that everything they've done has been right or wrong or let's say fair, but certainly the withdrawal of the US without an alternative does create challenges for global security.
So to that point, I mean, you make, and you also, Dinesh, you make a point about practicality. We ought to look at what we do and how we do business as a means of being practical and having a longer-term vision. But increasingly, socially, there is a visible tension between what people want to see and what businesses are doing. Without getting into something that is clearly not in my day job's parameters of talking about, but it is reasonably well known that today there are companies that would normally be sponsors of cultural and artistic events who are being told not to do so, or at least the events are being told not to have their money. So in that sense, one way is to say that you have a long-term perspective, you channelize all of your efforts to solving your problems in the long term, but the other is to say that, no, there is something that we're not going to accept and something that we are going to accept. Is there, to put it coarsely, is there a good money and a bad money? Is there an ethics to doing this?
I'd actually like to reframe that question, because I think something Vindy said is really important. A partnerism, a partner approach, a collaborative approach can be navigated for a win-win-win situation. And ultimately, in a healthy planetary system, that's what happens.
Sounds like something out of the job I do, but...
Absolutely. You're a hero in that case, Vikram. But I think this is really important, because then you can soften, you can have healthy competition, you can have expertise, which actually enables you to sort of move, you better yourself in a sense. You work to better yourself, and therefore you become a better partner in a wider sort of collaborative effort. And I think what Dinesh is talking about too is for those countries that have the benefit of all that solar energy to work in collaboration so that everyone wins. It's a partnerism.
Is society ready for this? Today, increasingly, it seems to me that society seems to be more polarized rather than less so around.
I think it's who you speak to be absolutely honest.
Okay.
And I think that the mainstream media is not helping this process, as you say. It is sort of not serving what I think is an impulse with many, many people that I work with around the world, and especially young people who really welcome the opportunity to work together to find out and to value unity and diversity, to value all the different voices, all the different areas of expertise. And one of the things I loved when I was in business and working in 36 countries and managing $500 million businesses a year is that ability to bring people together and learn from each other and grow together and move forward together. And I think the other thing with the partnerism, therefore, it also naturally brings into it partnerships on a community basis. So you're not just talking about the organisation. And I think you, Dinesh, said something earlier about the really great, or perhaps Vindy, the great companies are the ones that care for the communities.
Yes, of course.
As well. But you say, of course, but this needs to be absolutely, in action if we're going to, and widespread, not just the, the exceptions that prove the rule, as it were.
I would take maybe objection to that, because I think it's easy to tar business with saying that, look, they don't do enough good. Actually, I would argue that the best test in the end is longevity of a business.
I agree.
And businesses cannot succeed over a long period of time unless they cater to everybody, not just the shareholder.
Totally agree.
If they cater to their consumers, they cater to, the regulation, they cater to their employees, they cater to their suppliers, that is what makes for longevity. So you can succeed in business for 10 years or a few years.
In the short term.
But actually, when you look at business today, it's the mainstay of practically every economy in the world. That is what provides the bulk of GDP.
Couldn't agree with you more, except that you can do a lot of damage in 10 years.
Sure.
If you're actually running from a totally exploitative way. And the other thing I would also, I really agree with what you're saying in that regard in terms of longevity, but I would also say that even the inventor of GDP recognised that at best it was a poor measure. And,
Well, what is a good measure?
I would say progressively some of the dashboard measures that are coming out of some of the work that have been doing in the NGOs around the UN. I would say, for example, well-being measures. I would say that measures are not static. They also need to be dynamic as a part to emergence.
Well, I want to add a bit to what Vindy said about his trip to China and what we're doing in China. And it's a partnership. So, for example, wind and solar they provide energy, but they are sort of intermittent. And what you need is a base load of carbon-free energy.
Yeah.
And the only base load that I can think of is small nuclear reactors, which are the best, well, no, but the small nuclear
ones,
reactors are available
Small
now.
modular
SMRs.
Yes.
SMRs. Now, between 100 megawatts and 300 megawatts, well, one of the companies that produces them here is Rolls-Royce. India needs at least 2 or 3 dozen of them, for example. That could be a Make in India thing, for example. I've just studied the deal done by EFTA with India, and you would know much more about that, Vikram. These 4 countries, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland, all of 15 million people, they have agreed to let Indian workers come into their countries in 126 of 150, or 120 out of 156 service professions. And because they just don't have the people to work, number one. And number two, all the goods produced in these countries can get the benefit of a market of 1.4 billion, 1.4
billion people.
5 billion people.
Yeah.
And there's a kicker. And the kicker is, over 15 years, these 4 countries will invest 100 billion euros into India to make in India. That's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, and I'm saying, let's do this UK-India deal as well. I know there are 14 or 15 ago, because if the Europeans go and do it, then the UK will be left out in the cold.
But as you say, that's win-win.
But we aren't. I'm only talking win-win.
Yeah, I know you are and I am, and I think what Vindy is referring to. But how can we get win-win being the norm?
So so far we've talked about the theory of economics and what business does. We've talked about technology, we've talked about manufacturing. But the new economy is going to be based also around essentially technology-driven sectors. Technology by nature, particularly modern digital technologies, AI, are increasingly borderless technologies. So, to our panel's point of a more borderless world in which we cooperate rather than compete, a more forward-looking world in which we are positioning ourselves in a means to try and develop benefit in a longer-term sense across peoples rather than across spreadsheets. You are actually potentially at that moment. AI could be transformative. But there is the other way of looking at it, which is that so much of what has been done in the tech sector is also narrow vertical silos. They're high silos because once you get in, you're, in the entirety of it, billions of people can be in that silo. WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter. These don't cooperate across silos. These are not horizontal. You can't message from WhatsApp into an iMessenger ecosystem. So are we, in a sense, creating a new world of narrowness, or is there an opportunity to turn technology and AI into the more positive future you're talking about?
I think that if you think about AI And more broadly, if you just go back and look at the progression of technology over the last several hundred years, every time it's come, new technology, it has eventually got broad-based and benefited the whole planet. It always starts, and there must be some reward for the inventor, because otherwise, why would you invent it? So there has to be some reward, and to your point about some of these technologies not cooperating with each other, well, that is partly about getting a commercial return. But the interesting thing is technology percolates. It gets out into the ecosystem. Let's take a few examples. Let's take the internet. So when the internet came, and all these, on that basis, a lot of these companies got formed, and as you say, they don't talk to each other, and you created big verticals like Amazon and so on. But today, people in India are creating an open source platform.
Exactly.
So actually, they are using what exists to break down the barriers. So this is what happens actually, and the same will happen with artificial intelligence. Today, the investment is coming from a handful of companies because they are the people who have the resources to put in these massive investments. The only other people who can do it are governments. As the government actually funded a lot of the development of the internet, as we know, the US government.
Yes.
Now, these companies are putting in billions of dollars for developing these new language models. But that will percolate. And actually, the benefits of that are already visible in healthcare, in education, in commercial application, productivity. They're already visible. And there's no way that that AI will remain, let's say, the domain of a few companies. Actually, the important thing about AI, not only will it percolate into companies as they get access to it all over the world, individuals will benefit, because that's the great benefit of AI today. So I think this is a very potent force. Now, should it be regulated? Of course, because there is a potential for a lot of negative action as well. And I think what I see, which I feel quite encouraged about, is that even the technology companies seem to be learning from what happened after the open internet. And they're already talking about self-regulation. And you see some of the best companies, if you read what Microsoft says about its approach to regulation, it makes for very, very interesting reading. It's hard to find fault with it. The question is, can we make it happen, and can it land?
Can it be replicable?
Yeah.
Across companies rather than individuals.
And that, I agree with you. I think that impetus is actually happening and recognizing now. There was a recent gathering in Panama on AGI, on ethical AGI. And the essential way of going forward, there's a constitutional base now, a draft base for ethical and a good thing. Yeah, and so that's really happening. And as you say, the learning from the, from the problems that arose from the internet. I would disagree with you on one person in terms of who benefited and had to benefit, and that was Tim Berners-Lee.
Yeah.
Because Tim Berners-Lee is the only person I'm aware of who altruistically gave the potential of what the internet could be, which he gave.
He chose to give. I mean, it wasn't...
Yeah, he chose.
Well, he chose. No, of course he chose. But what I'm trying to say is maybe if we start moving our perceptions of who we are and how we relate with each other, then more of those choices can be made.
Well, I think we're making a big effort on that side.
I don't disagree, but I think the more the better.
With the India stack, which has got Aadhaar and then UPI and everything else, I think it's going to be exported to all the African countries.
Fantastic.
It's going all over. It's open, it's easy. I've written a book.
Yes.
You've got it.
Why not to the UK, actually, frankly?
And the UK.
Because it's applicable anywhere.
So it might be silos, as Vindy says, it's moved out of the silos to the common man. AI is going into silos at the moment.
Yes.
In the US. And it's all these guys are being really good at carpentry, AI really good at plumbing or whatever, But the thing is, it's going to move out.
Yes.
And what India's really good at is the technology side of things, software, etc. And even if the Americans don't give it, these guys will make it.
Will do it, yeah.
And that's why it's going to go to the rest of the world, and very easily.
Yeah, I agree. I'm working with large language models at the moment. Okay. And working with, alongside the UN's Pact for the Future and Summit of the Future, not conjoined, but alongside, but as a wider basis to bring this sort of sense of deep and rapid transformation, convergence forward across economics, education, governance, all the other. And what we've really valued is having it be human-led, heart-centred, but AGI underpinned. And the AGI we're using is quite extraordinary because, of course, like anything else, it's the knowledge base that's within it that actually then answers your questions in the responses. So, for example, an example that we're giving at the moment is if you ask ChatGPT, can you give me a business plan for plastics packaging? It will do that. And it will also probably give you a way of greenwashing that. If you ask this particular project that we're beta testing through this process, which is all things unitive, relational, altruistic, socially based, all the rest of it, give me a draft plan for plastic packaging, it's more likely to say, why do you want to do that? You know, you could look at this or look at that or look at something else. So, I mean, I think that has to be absolutely transparent, that that's what where you're coming from. But I think there are ways in which you can really heighten that sort of sense of progress rather than going to the lowest common denominator.
We have a few minutes to bring the audience into Q&A. Is there Is there a microphone that we could? All right, thanks.
Speak with your mouth.
The gentleman here, the tie.
Thank you very much for very enlightening session. A few comments and.
Would you give us your name, sir?
My name is Zafar Masood, and I'm visiting from Pakistan. Some talk in Urdu also on a couple of things, which I can't express in English too well for the challenges that the two of the countries are facing. So first is that, you know, I would have expected this session to be more broader than too narrowed down on environment as such, because I think the ethical economics is much beyond that than just the environment per se. And it's becoming even more center of the plate with capitalism being questioned. Well, there is no doubt that capitalism is the right way to go, but what form of capitalism? And that leaves behind a lot of responsibility on the businesses than the governments as such. So the role of regulator is actually derived from the behavior of the businesses overall. If they act responsibly, then the role of regulators could be limited. And that's my first question. That, you know, on the role of regulators, how far do you see this whole ethical economics evolving, and how important that role is? The second one is more spicy one, is related to, and Vikram, perhaps that's more pertinent to you.
I'm the moderator.
The question is, diverted to you.
Not the spice.
So, while we understand the importance of globalization and the businesses, we've talked about China and America and how the consumer in America are now suffering because of, you know, the politics coming in the middle. The similar is the situation between India and Pakistan as well. So 45% of the items that Pakistan import today are cheaper in India than importing from the rest of the world. 70% of the items that Pakistan export to the rest of the world, if India is importing that at a higher price than they could have imported from Pakistan. And that alone on the Pakistan's GDP, and I'm pretty sure the similar would be the impact on Indian GDP as well, is somewhere close to 3.5 to 4%. I'm sorry, 2.5 to 3%. Now, given that situation, how will you take the politics out of the considerations for businesses? आप आज ऐलान कर दें, और वो जो विक्रम आप कह रहे थे about society ready है या नहीं है, या ये governments हैं, मेरे ख्याल से governments का problem ज़्यादा है. आप आज announce कर दें पाकिस्तान इंडिया का match in Lahore, Qaddafi Stadium, आप देखिएगा कि क्या होता है वहाँ पर. How will the people react on both the sides? It's the government which has to realize all of this. And my question to you is, the second question is, how will that be taken out of the equation?
Thank you.
I could answer the first one.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
We did start with to be fair, we did start the discussion with the larger piece about capitalism and
Sure.
markets and
The thing about regulators, and you're talking about essentially government departments, to get permissions to put a solar farm, for example, because I know that business, in the UK, France, and Germany takes 5 years. And this is when governments want green energy. Okay? In Romania, where I have my solar farm, it's taken me 3.5 years, which is brilliant. Yeah? I don't know how long it takes in India, but I can tell you that 5 years is too long to do that. And it's the same for wind. It's the same for nuclear will be higher. So that's my answer to the first question. It's governments should not, it should be a half-half house where businessmen and government civil servants work together. One window policy, do it in a year. What's the problem? Okay? I'm not saying 2 weeks, do it in a year. Sorry.
Could I build on that? I think, your question is a really good one. And it's not just environment. When you talk about ethicality in economics, it is a much broader idea. It is about thinking about all your stakeholders. It is about diversity. It is about inclusion. It is about environment, of course. But it is about making sure that you benefit a country where you operate in whilst you extract commercial benefit from it. So it is a much broader idea. I think that businesses play a very important role in creating the positive climate in which regulation can operate. One of the responsibilities of business is to engage with governments and actually create more effective and better regulation. It is, I think, infructuous to have an antagonistic relationship, whether instituted by the government. We have had many examples where governments bash business and businesses bash government. That's completely unhelpful. This can only happen, you can get a more productive relationship by engaging. Think about the pandemic and what happened, at least in some parts of the world. Governments, regulators, commercial organizations worked, and suddenly you found that where it took you 15 years to approve a drug, vaccines were approved in a year. So it is possible, I think, but business cannot absolve itself of the responsibility. They have to work with the regulator.
So to the bit that you addressed to me, the simple fact is, look, economics, as I was trying to suggest also with my question, isn't always an absolute driver of governance. It cannot be. Otherwise, societies, governments, nations aren't on an equal footing. The same reason that governments intervene within borders to protect different stakeholders, different scales of people, so too do governments intervene, does politics intervene between nations. Is that a good thing? I'm afraid that's for people to decide. It may not necessarily be the most economically appropriate decision. And to the second part of your question, मैं ऐलान तो नहीं कर सकता हूँ गद्दाफी स्टेडियम में मैच हो, मगर मैं ज़रूर ये ऐलान कर सकता हूँ कि कल न्यूयॉर्क में मैच होगा.
That's right.
Next question, Nadeem. Sorry.
Thank you. My question is directed to my friend Windy.
Sorry, I should have translated that exchange, but anyway, afterwards, those who didn't get it can come to me for a translation. Please.
This is specifically for Windy. The world has seen a huge sea change from a virtual zero interest rate to 10 times more, as we are seeing on the base rate side. Given that reality, do you think there'll be huge compromises made which were not being looked into very seriously because money was so cheap, and CSR, ESG, climate and everything was a part of a deal that you made, and we do a lot of work in Africa, as you know, was all a part of our contract. I'm seeing less and less of that happening now, and the stress is more on 3 to 5 year, or at best 7-year exit, and therefore this can be put to the back burner because money is no longer cheap. There has to be an exit with a profit, and therefore some things have to be kept to the back burner. Is that something or a reality that we're going to see for a long time to come?
Can I take a few questions so that everybody, as many get a chance? Please, sir, the gentleman in the tan jacket, and the lady after that. The gentleman there with the tan jacket.
Not sure whether this is a question, but first of all, thank you for a brilliant analysis. And congratulations to Jude, who's been handling the two business guys on either side, trying to compel them to think differently and think in unity. But I suspect that we are at the cusp of a major change at the political levels, because I think that there are issues with people grappling with, have the political frameworks outlived their utility. At a social level, at the economics level, by the way, I'm not sure whether the heading, ethical economics, it suggests that before this it was unethical economics.
Wasn't it?
But in the context of where we are, and Jude, to your point, with regard to Vedic philosophy, now there's a fundamental difference between the Western education and Vedic philosophy, because all the education that we've been through and in some of the top institutes, it's all linked to numbers. Yeah. There is zero importance that is paid to satisfaction, to a sense of well-being. How do you actually put numbers to that? It is not possible. And therefore, I think that in the years to come, there will be this big fight between trying to get to a level of well-being, and how does one deal with that?
I need to rush you up,
So
please.
would just like your opinions on that.
For the lady there. And
Thank you. This actually follows on from the gentleman's question. It's a question for Jude. Because listening to the panel, I feel like we've been listening to two different radio channels, with Jude speaking on one and the two gentlemen speaking on a different radio channel. And there are moments in which you sort of overlap. Jude, I think you must have the patience of a saint to do the work that you do. Are we going to get there? Because I think the change that is required with economists is so fundamental, and I'm feeling like we maybe just won't ever get there.
so, to summarize these quickly, the question of one, first of all, how do you get to do the right thing if money is expensive and business is going to be difficult? And how do you essentially try and bring the idea of doing good vis-a-vis the idea of also making sure that whoever's trying to do the activity has value for it? We'll start with you.
Yeah.
We take a quick round.
Okay, very fast. If you can't have running water and electricity, which 300 million people in India don't have, first thing you want is running water and electricity and a roof on your head, over your head. We're fortunate here that we have it. Then you go and educate your kids, or you get a standard of living where you say, okay, money is not important because we've been running after money the whole time, trying to feed ourselves. We can think of other things freely. Now, you might turn around and say, sorry, that's not the way to go. You should just think of other things, forget the money, it'll come to you. But my experience has been that no one will give you a penny if you don't go and get it yourself and work hard the conventional way. And once you get it, you can then say, money's not important. You see, I would rather do this or that and the other. That doesn't mean that going after Vedic philosophy, etc., is bad. It's not. It's even better going after Vedic philosophy, but you still need the money. You still need food. So that's when we'll get that.
I'd just suggest it's not a binary question. I think it's not an either-or. I think it's a both-and.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at sort of very basic, sort of the Maslow sort of sense of, yes, you need shelter, you need food, but you get to a point where you have those, and it's not that money isn't important anymore, but it's less important, and other things become more important. And if we can, as a society, and I mean globally, I don't just mean in nation states, but globally, come to that perspective, authentically, that we are inseparable, authentically, that we all belong, and then move forward together, we can actually create together, co-create an extraordinary, I was going to say renaissance, but I don't think it is a renaissance because I don't think we've ever done it before. We're in the first time as a planetary species where we could do this if we choose to. But if we stay in this illusion of separation with all the other that we're playing around it, we will continue to have these debates around the periphery of what's really important. And what's really important, it seems to me, is our humanity at the very core of who we are and our humanity in relationship to our planetary home.
Well, look, it's hard to top what Jude said, but I want to answer the lady's question, which was really pointed, about there being two discussions going on. Actually, I don't think there are two discussions going on. I see it as one discussion, because what Jude has just said is about everyone listening to each other, understanding each other, having empathy, and cooperating. That's the essence of what she's saying. And I think when she talks about unity, that's not different from what I was saying. I was talking about global businesses. I was looking at it from the perspective that I understand the best, which is business. The role that business can play in doing what she's articulating is already being played. And I think we would be short-sighted not to see it and say, oh, well, this is not happening at all. Multinationals are playing it, and they're there for long generations because they're doing it. Other businesses are doing it. They're doing exactly this because they cannot succeed for a long term unless they are actually globally enveloping everybody and catering to diversity, inclusion, everything. So that's what they're trying to do. And I can think of so many examples, we're out of time, where companies are doing that and therefore serving the cause of unifying the world and actually uplifting it at the same time. That's, I think, a really important aspect that business can provide, but importantly is providing. Is every business doing it? No. But is every human being, acceptance of this philosophy? No. I think it's up to us, really, to do it from our vantage point.
Yeah. Okay.
So to quickly conclude with just a quick thought, in a way in which we can sort of bring together some of these ideas. One of which is that if you look at what is said in the Nasadiya Sukta of the Rig Veda, who can know the unknowable? What does that actually mean? It means we begin from a position of less certitude, that there are realities that we are yet to learn about, and it makes sense for us to approach many of the world's challenges, life's challenges, with a degree of humility. I think increasingly we are coming back to that point that no nation, no government, no business, nobody has a monopoly of the truth. And I think that's a great way of starting to approach a complex question of how we go forward. And the other, it sounds trite, but there truly is a time and place for everything. And in a sense, what Dinesh was trying to suggest when you talked about your hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you are also putting in place a notion implicit in our ancient culture, which is that you go through stages of life as a student, a learner, as a householder, creating wealth and value and contributing to society, and eventually by moving ahead into a life of contemplation where your pressures upon the earth, so to speak, are reduced. So I don't necessarily see that we are speaking from different sort of camps here. I think our goal has to be to try and take classical business to a point where it can serve the larger purpose of ethics. And we have to find a way of making ethics valuable enough for people to do business around it. Thank you very much to all our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.